In this video, I'll show you how to write a script that will help make copying macros from one game into another very quick and easy. Now, a little bit of context about what we're about to do. If you have a Pro Roll20 subscription, you know that you have this option called the Transmogrifier. And the Transmogrifier allows you to copy items from one game to another. So you can copy pages and maps and characters and jukebox items and handouts, basically everything except macros. So the workaround that a lot of folks have come up with is you create a character sheet, and within that character sheet, you put all your macros into the abilities section of that character, and then you can take that character sheet and use the Transmogrifier to move it around from one game to another. And that's great, but what that means is if you've already created a whole ton of macros like I have here, you're now looking at a long exercise of copy and paste, and that's not a whole lot of fun. So what I'm going to show you how to do is create a script that generates a new character, copies all of the macros that you have in the game into that character, and then you can take that character and move it into a new game using the Transmogrifier. So let's see how to do that. Okay, so I'm in my original game here. This is my first game, the game I want to copy the macros out of. So I'm in that game settings page. I'm going to go into the API scripts section, and we're going to create a new script. And we're going to go ahead and give this script a more descriptive name. We're going to call this script the macro mover. And then we'll make this a little bit bigger so it's a little easier to read. There we go. All right, so the first thing we're going to say here is on chat:_message. So we're going to type a special command into the chat box. And so we're going to say function msg. We're going to take the message that was typed into the chat box, and we're going to run it through whatever's in between these curly braces here. And so we want to start out by checking to make sure that what was typed into the chat box was an API command, and it was the command to actually export our macros. And so to do that, we're going to say if msg.type = API. So is this a command that starts with an exclamation point, which is what designates everything as an API command, and msg.content.index of export macros = 0. So if the message type is API and the message starts with export macros, that's what export macros = 0 means here, that this is the first thing in the command. So if we come in here and we typed export macros, that's going to trigger our command. If we had typed hello export macros, that would not trigger the command because export macros is no longer the first thing in the command. All right, so assuming it is an API command that starts with export macros, then we want to create our character sheet. So for that, we're going to say var Mr. Macro. That's what we're going to name our character because, hey, all the good automated stuff starts with Mr. Mr. Coffee, Mr. Radar, Mr. Macro equals create object. This is how we create an item in Roll20, is with the create object command. And the type of object we're going to create is a character. We're going to put in a comma, and then we're going to put in a pair of open curly braces, and that's going to allow us to define properties about the character we're creating. And because we're only using this character sheet to hold macros, we're not going to worry about any of the character's attributes like their strength or their dexterity or anything like that. Really all we're going to worry about is their name, which is going to be Mr. Macro. And we'll also specify the controlled by property. So this will be who actually can control this character, and that's going to be msg.playerID. And this says the player who typed this command into the chat box is the one who can control this character sheet. So for us, that's going to be us as the GM, right? So that's all there is to creating the character sheet. That's pretty easy. Now what we need to do is get a list of all of the macros that exist in our game. And so for that, we're going to say var macro list equals find objects, open parenthesis, open curly brace, and we're going to specify the properties of the object that we're looking for. And in this case, all we're looking for is macros. There's no other search criteria we have. We just want items that are macros. So for this, we're just going to say type macro. And that's going to give us back an array containing all of the macros in our game. So now we've got that array. What we want to do is say for each macro in that list that we just created, we want to make an ability on our character sheet. So every macro gets read out of the game and then plugged into the character sheet. That's what we're looking to do. So what we're going to say here is _.each. And underscore is a special JavaScript helper library that Roll20 contains. And it has a ton of useful functions. But what we're interested in here is this _.each method. And what that allows us to do is iterate over each item inside this array. So what I can do now is say for each, and then the list that we're working with, that's going to be the macro list, comma, function, macro. And basically what macro means here is this is the individual element from the macro list. So for each macro in the macro list, then we're going to do whatever's between these curly braces right here. For each macro in the macro list, then we're going to do something. So what we're going to say here is we're going to create object ability. So we're going to make an ability on our character sheet. And then we need to define the properties of the ability that we're plugging in. So it's just like what we did up here when we created our character. We said we were creating object character. We defined the properties of that character. Now we're going to define abilities and give the properties for those. So first one we're going to define is the character ID. This is what character sheet are we putting these abilities into? Well, that's going to be Mr. Macro.get ID. So we're going to put these onto Mr. Macro's character sheet. Then we're going to put in the name of the ability. Well, we want the name of the ability to be the same as the macro's name. So we're going to say macro get name. Then we're going to put in the action. This is the actual text of the item. So if you go into your character sheet here and we click add and we look at this guy right here. So this is the name. This is the action, which contains all of the actual operations that the ability will do. So for the action, that's going to be the macro's action. So macro.get action. Now, your abilities can be token actions just like your macros can be. So we're going to say is token action macro get is token action. So as you can see, the structure of a macro and the structure of an ability are nearly identical. But there is one difference here. In a macro, if you look here, you'll see you have this option visible to players, which means that you can have macros that are just for you as the GM, or you could make them available to all your players or just individual players. You can't really do that on a character sheet ability. There's no visible to players option because this is something that a player would have access to, everything on their character sheet. So we still want to capture that information. And there's actually a property on the ability that doesn't show up in the character sheet. It's called description. And so what we're going to do is use the unshown description space to hold macro.get visible to. So even though this won't show up in the character sheet, it will still be stored and we'll be able to access it later. Okay, so this is all there is to it. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to save this now. Okay, and everything's going to spin back up in just a second. Okay, I'm good to go. So now I'm going to go into my game here, my original game, the game I want to copy all these macros from, right? And I'm going to go into my chat box and I am going to say export macros. Enter. Okay, and now we come over here and we search for Mr. Macro. There he is, new character sheet with all of our macros inside of it. So if we click on one of these, we can see we can edit it. This one just rolls a d20, right? And I can run this. There we go. We can see that ran my roll d20 command. So all my macros are now in here. Awesome. So now what I can do is I could go into my target game, the game I wanted to import the macros into. I could go down to the Transmogrifier, and I could say that I wanted to pull from demo game, I want to get Mr. Macro. Right? I can just drag him right over. Okay, so he shows up now. Close this. Go to my page, and there he is, Mr. Macro. And I can actually run the macros right from the character sheet if I want to. I can just come right in here. I can click on the button, and there we go. Now that just works. But if you want to have all the macros back here in this panel, then there's a little bit more scripting we can do. So let me show you how we can do that. All right, back to my code. And back to our script. And we're going to come down here to the end, and we're going to create a second chat command. We're going to say on chat message. So we're going to do exactly the same thing as we did before. Function MSG. And we're going to, again, start out very similar here. I'm actually just going to copy this line right here. Make this easy, right? But we're not going to do export macros a second time. We're going to do import macros. And we're going to make sure we've got a closing curly brace for our if statement there. Okay, now, basically we're going in the opposite direction. We're going to take Mr. Macro, and we're going to grab all of the abilities out of Mr. Macro and put them into the macro section of our game. So we're going to start out by getting a reference to Mr. Macro. So var Mr. Macro, find objects, open paren, open curly brace. And just like before, we're going to specify the properties of the item we're looking for. So we're looking for an item whose type is character and whose name is Mr. Macro. Now here's the thing. Find objects is going to return an array, right? It's going to give us back a list of all of the objects that match our search. We should only have one Mr. Macro in our game. So we really only care about the first one that we find. So you've seen me do things like this before. What I'll do is I'll say another line afterwards, var, my Mr. Macro, and it will be something like Mr. Macro index 0. And so that would give us the reference to Mr. Macro. But there's a shorthand way we can do this. We can actually just put that bracket 0 right here. And so what that's saying is run the find objects command. That gives us back an array. And then give us the first item from that array and assign it to Mr. Macro. So this is just kind of keeps it all on one line. Now what we need to do is get a list of all the abilities Mr. Macro has. So that'll be var ability list equals find objects. So again, another find object command, same syntax here. This time around, we're going to be looking for objects of type ability and who belong to character ID, and that's going to be Mr. Macro.get ID. So basically we're saying get me a list of all of the abilities on Mr. Macro's character sheet. And now we're going to do another for each loop, right? So again, using that _JS library. This time around, we're going to say for each ability in the ability list. So we're going to go through, iterate over each ability in that ability list. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to create an object, but we're creating macros, right? So we're going to create a macro. And here are the attributes for that macro. The macro's name is going to be the ability get name. So we're basically doing the same thing we did earlier, just backwards. It's going to be action is ability get action. And then the is token action will be ability.get is token action. We're going to set visible to, so this is what lets us set the visibility of the macro. So if we look at a macro here and we come on it, this guy right here, visible2. This is that value that we stored in the hidden property of the ability. So we're going to say visible2 is equal to ability get description. And then lastly, we need to specify the player ID of the player who's creating the macro. And so that's going to be player ID : msg.player ID. So basically we're saying whoever ran this command is going to be logged as the player who created the macro. All right, so let's save that. Okay, so now what I need to do is copy this whole thing. So Control A, Control C. I'm going to go into my target game. This is the game that I just moved Mr. Macro into. And I'm going to go to that game's API script setting. I'm going to create the same script here, right? So macro mover, save that. Okay, and there we go. And so now what I'm going to do is go into my game. Again, we have no macros right now, but we do have Mr. Macro. So let's run ! Import macros. And now, there we go. All of our macros are here. And let's just run one of them. See, it's got that information. On my phobias table macro that I had right here, you can see this one is visible to all players. So if I look at that one here, all right, so there's my roll phobia, and it is visible to all players. So that copied all that information over correctly, and I can roll one of these, and there we go. There's my macro. Now, one thing to mention here is if your macros are referencing specific token IDs, like I have some here for this ambush, those will not work because the token IDs will not carry over from game to game. So if you have been using specific token IDs in your macros, you will need to update those, but doing that manually is a whole lot easier and less tedious than going through and copying every single macro over. So just want to let you know that you'll want to keep that in mind. Now, one last tweak that I want to make to the script is, again, select everything here. We'll just press tab and we'll go up to the top and we're going to say on ready, function. I'm going to open paren. I'm going to delete this extra parenthesis right here, open curly brace, close, curly brace, close paren, semicolon, and save. And that's just going to make it so that we won't try to execute the export or import command prior to the campaign being ready. So if we tried to run one of these before the campaign had fully loaded, then it may cause issues. Okay, so this will work exactly as it is, but we should do a few other things just from a coding best practices standpoint. And the first of those is right in here when we run our export command. If I go back into the game I've been exporting from, and I run that command again, look what happens. We get another Mr. Macro. And then if I do it again, we get another Mr. Macro. So two things. One, I'm clogging up my game with extra Mr. Macros. And two, I don't necessarily know which one of these Mr. Macros is the most recent one without opening them up and looking at them. So what I want to do is have the script check to see if Mr. Macro already exists in the game, and if he does, then remove him. So for this, what we're going to do is come up in here, and we're going to say if our existing macros equals find objects, open paren, open curly brace, type, character, comma, name, colon, Mr. Macro. Okay, so that's going to give us our array of characters that are equal to Mr. Macro. And then what we're going to say here is if existing macros does not equal undefined. So if we actually have characters there, then we want to remove them. So we're going to use that underscore each again, underscore dot each. And we're going to say existing macros function Mr. Macro, and we'll say Mr. Macro dot remove. So basically here for every existing Mr. Macro that exists, we're going to remove him. So I'm going to save the script. All right. And then we'll run this again. And if all this works well, then what should happen is these extra Mr. Macros should go away. We should be left with just one. So let's do that. And there we go. We only have one Mr. Macro now. So that worked just fine. Okay, so now we're cleaning out any existing Mr. Macros. That's great. We want to do something similar down here in the import function. So let's say that somebody forgot to transmogrify over Mr. Macro. Well, we don't want to try and run this command because then the API is going to throw failures. So what we're going to say here is if Mr. Macro equals undefined. So if Mr. Macro is undefined, that is we couldn't find Mr. Macro, then we want to send chat from the API, and we're going to say, please import Mr. Macro and return. So this is going to check to see if Mr. Macro exists. It's very similar to what we did up here. We're checking to see if he exists, and if he doesn't, then we're going to send a message over to the user saying, please import Mr. Macro. So let's save the script, okay, and let's delete Mr. Macro here. So there is no Mr. Macro. And now we'll try to import our macros. And we get a message saying, please import Mr. Macro. So that way, the script isn't going to have any errors. It's going to recover gracefully from a situation where Mr. Macro doesn't exist. One final thing that you may want to do, and that is remove Mr. Macro after you're done importing. So let's say we've loaded all of our macros. We don't need the Mr. Macro character sheet anymore. Then we can go ahead and say Mr. Macro dot remove. And so that will find the Mr. Macro character sheet, take all of the macros from the Mr. Macro character sheet, put them into the main games page, put them into here, and then delete Mr. Macro. So again, if you don't want to just run the macros from the Mr. Macro sheet, you can do this. If you do want to run the macros from that sheet, then don't bother with this line. But in the version of the script that I put in the description below, it will include all of these extra steps just so that you'll have them available. Go ahead, click save. And that's it. We are good to go now. So there you have it, a script to help you make moving macros from one game to another a whole lot easier. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please give it a like and consider subscribing. And in the meantime, folks, until next time, have a great day.